In 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, looking to synthesize a drug to help stimulate blood circulation, inadvertently invents LSD. 5 years later, in what is a prologue to every apocalyptic plague movie, Hoffman, the dumbass, mishandles some of the chemicals, ingests it through his sin, and immediately begins to trip balls. He thought he was losing his mind, and frankly, he deserves it for mishandling chemicals in a lab. Now, eventually, he does come down off of his surprise LSD trip and realizes the mind-altering potential of the drug. And so he gets the company he works for, Sandoz, which we now know as Novartis, to make freely available as much LSD as any researcher in the world would want. And that kicks off the first 20-year stretch of psychedelic research. Now, we know this doesn't last, in large part because of Timothy Leary with his turn-on, tune-in, and drop-out anti-establishment cheerleading that would push LSD into the underground, make it a Schedule I drug, and really put in a 30-year moratorium on psychedelic research. Science is still digging out from all of that countercultural baggage, but it's 2019. Take a look around. A lot of us could really use something to get out of our own heads, and that's why Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind seems to arrive at just the right time. And right away, Pollan dives in and takes umbrage with that Schedule I designation and how LSD doesn't fit that description. A, because it is not addictive. In fact, LSD is the exact opposite of addictive. The last thing you want to do after an LSD trip is more LSD. In that sense, it's akin to childbirth. Immediately after childbirth, hard no, but eventually given time, it could be considered again. Or so I've heard. And despite what you may think, you cannot overdose on LSD, and Lord knows they've tried. They've conducted studies on elephants, dosing them with 300 milligrams of LSD. Now, to put that into context, the ego-shredding psychedelic trips that others take later on in the story are achieved with 150 micrograms. So this elephant, 300 milligrams, starts freaking out, so the researchers pump it full of Thorazine and then pump it full of tranquilizers, and it subsequently dies, but probably from the drug cocktail. So they try the experiment again with 2 more elephants. I don't know where they're finding these elephants, pump them full of LSD and nothing else, and they survived. Although I'm sure they're wandering around the African savannah right now with the ability to taste sound. And Schedule I drugs, to earn that grading, need to have no medicinal benefits, and Pollan spends a lot of the time in the book dismantling that particular argument. And it's coming at a time where people's perceptions towards drugs are changing. You have the legal prescription drug Oxycontin leading to an opioid epidemic. Meanwhile, the much vilified marijuana has been made completely legal here in Canada. And then you have the notion of LSD microdosing. And to give you an idea, a typical hallucination-inducing trip is at 150 micrograms, whereas a microdose is around 10 micrograms. There's Ayelet Waldman's latest book, A Really Good Day, where she talks about her experiments in microdosing and the grips of these violent mood storms that affect not only her, but her loved ones. And seemingly impervious to any other prescription drug, she tries microdosing for a month. And it has a profound impact on her mood, to the point where even her kids notice her new chill. Microdosing has also hit Silicon Valley. Folks there find that it has helped them improve on their creativity, increase their focus, raised up their well-being, reduced their stress. Steve Jobs counts his LSD trip as one of his peak experiences in his life. Tim Ferriss of the 4-Hour Workweek, also a big fan. Cary Grant, having given up on yoga and meditation, had well over 100 low-dose LSD trips in his lifetime. And yes, I have even tried psychedelics. It was a summer long ago when my best friend in the world showed up at my door, rang my doorbell. This is a time before cell phones, where friends would often just ring each other's doorbells. Anyway, he showed up at my front porch with 2 tabs of California sunshine and proposed that we drop acid for the first time. Now, understand this was apropos of nothing. We'd never discussed this before. We'd never debated the merits of doing acid or psychedelics of any time. And so naturally, there on my front porch, we dropped some acid and nothing. So, disappointed over our first psychedelic experience, we doubled down, and because we live in the hood, we managed to find 2 grams of shrooms and tried to ingest those for the first time ever. Now, shrooms taste like something unearthed from Tutankhamun's tomb. They're pretty nasty things. We muscled them down. Now, as newbie psychonauts, we did not realize there's a latency period. The stuff doesn't take effect right away, and so in about an hour after we had dropped those 2 hits of acid, everything slammed into us like a brick wall. It was a hell of a first trip, but all good. 6 hours later, both of us were on our backs in the grass in a public park, looking up at the stars in the skies being pulled up and down on silver threads, just hypnotized. We were like two babies in a galaxy-sized mobile. And I know sharing that experience probably changes your perception of me. There's a lot of baggage associated with psychedelics and psychedelic use. It's been shaped by decades of public policy and prevailing attitudes. Ayelet Waldman recounts her own experience telling to baby boomer dinner guests and their pearl-clutching horror after that admission. So they looked at her as if she admitted to clubbing baby seals in her spare time. Meanwhile, getting day drunk on blush with a chaser of Xanax and watching soap operas hardly warrants a comment. And there's a ton of new scientific research being done to show the benefits of psychedelics, and there's a changing public perceptions towards those drugs. And Pollan certainly helps as well. Pollan is an eminently reasonable science writer. I loved his earlier work in defense of food with the mantra, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I like that common sense approach, especially in light of how passionate people can get around food, whether you're vegan or gluten-free, keto, paleo.
Broccoli, that's what my food eats. That's my food's food. And I don't appreciate you eating that.
Or whatever is in favor at the moment. And it's the same sense of reasonableness that he brings to the talk of psychedelics. Now, Pollan is a hands-dirty type of writer. He learned to butcher meat while writing The Omnivore's Dilemma. He built his own writer shed when writing A Place of One's Own. And here, at 60, he decides he is going to try psychedelics for the first time in his life. And we're not talking microdose, but heroic doses of 150, 200 micrograms. Now, these are guided sessions performed by professionals. This isn't recreational use. Pollan warns against that. And those people with bipolar tendencies or a genealogical history of schizophrenia, psychedelics can induce an episode. But to be fair, stressful life events like a divorce can do the same thing. Pollan also talks about how psychedelics have been found to have profound effects with those suffering from a terminal illness, depression, and alcoholism and addiction. Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, wanted to introduce LSD therapy in Alcoholics Anonymous in the 50s. This spirituality or surrendering to a higher power can trace its roots back to a psychedelic experience that Wilson had himself that he credits for his sobriety. And with terminal patients, Johns Hopkins University right now is doing studies with volunteers that are terminal cancer patients and found that a psychedelic session reduced their feelings of anxiety and depression. And these effects lasted for 6 months. Pollan notes that the statistical effect size of these trials are at or above 1.0, which is unprecedented in a psychiatric treatment. To put this into context, SSRI antidepressants had a statistical effect size of 0.3 during clinical trials, which was still enough to get these approved and produced as drugs that we recognize as Zoloft, Prozac, and Lexapro. So Pollan dives into the question as to why are psychedelics so effective, and part of it has to do with its ego-shredding capabilities. By shredding the ego, it dissolves our self and separate from other things. Now, scientifically, it's tied to the default mode network of the brain. The default mode network is the part of the brain that we activate when we daydream and self-reflect and worry. It's essentially the ego. But it's also the orchestra conductor of the brain that's directing traffic. It's processing all the signals that are coming in from our senses and filtering out a lot of it because we'd be overwhelmed otherwise. It's like when we first learn how to drive a car. There's just so much information that we're processing from the pedestrians, the traffic lights, the street signs, the side view mirrors, the rear view mirrors, as we're managing this ton of metal and plastic hurtling at bone-crushing speeds down the road with our hands and feet. It's a lot to take in, but over time we fall into predictable patterns, and it's almost like we can do it unconsciously. We do the same thing with our emotions, and we fall into predictable patterns of self-doubt and worry. An analogy that Pollan uses is a hill covered in snow. Our everyday experiences create tracks down that hill, and over time those tracks get engraved, the ruts get deeper, and we just tend to automatically fall into those ruts with our day-to-day experience. Now, psychedelics, by shutting down the default network, it's like shaking the snow globe and laying down a fresh coat of powder on that hill. This allows us to take new ways down that hill, and it's an incredibly freeing and liberating experience. But it's hard to write about those experiences without sounding all hippy-dippy. As Pollan puts it, insights gleaned while under the influence of psychedelics travel that knife edge between profundity and utter banality. A philosophy professor, somewhat embarrassed, but at the same time absolutely assured of the compelling nature of experience, can only articulate after a psilocybin experience this revelation that love conquers all. And Pollan himself experiences watching himself pee while under the influence of magic mushrooms and recounting it as the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. This cascading waterfall of diamonds clashing into this pool that broke up into a billion clattering fractals of light. And even myself, in the grips of magic mushrooms, hunched over a square of beach sand where time had become this flat circle, and I was absolutely convinced that I could see the footsteps of every creature ever since time prehistoric that had stepped foot in that area, layered on top of each other. Crazy, right? I know. Psychology is the least understood of the medical sciences, and when you consider the advancements made in fields like cardiology and neurology, psychology has a lot of catching up to do. And with a growing epidemic of depression, I don't think we can rule psychedelics out of hand. And I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, ideas of how it's wonky with your chromosomes, or that one friend you know that thought he was an orange and tried to peel himself. Not to mention those theories put forward like magic mushrooms being an extraterrestrial communication device, a galactic phone home spore seeded across the galaxies to connect us with something other. But regardless, books like A Really Good Day as well as How to Change Your Mind can really start to change the public's perception and start initiating conversations around psychedelics. Now, if you want to do some more research, there's this great YouTube channel out of the Netherlands called Drug Labs, where young, spunky millennials try every drug and film the results. It's well produced, it's well lit, it's like Mythbusters on drugs. Worth checking out. I'll have a link down to that below. So that's it for this week. 2019, I have to say, some fantastic reads so far, and I'm excited to share them with you once I get around to filming them. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a great week of reading, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.